Okay, I'm just trying to stream the session on Facebook and then we're good to go. But it's not working. Okay. Okay, we're live. So, hello everybody. Can you all see my screen? Yes, okay. So hello everybody, good evening, good morning, good afternoon to you all. Welcome back to those who are familiar with the Beauvoir Webinar Series, and welcome to those who are attending for the first time. For those of you who are attending for the first time, we're excited to have you today, and I'd like to briefly introduce the Beauvoir Webinar Series just for a couple of minutes. So this event is part of the Beauvoir Webinar Series, which is a project that Gina Opiniano and I have been organizing for the International Simone de Beauvoir Society since 2020. And if you're interested in Simone de Beauvoir, you might want to take a look at our former sessions. We had 7 sessions, and today is number 8. So it's already a big number, and we are very proud of this. Here's the list of the session on my screen. Sometimes it's a book discussion like today, or it can be a roundtable with several specialists exploring a topic. It was the case for the session on writing Beauvoir's life, for example. It can also be interviews. For example, last January, Sylvie Le Bon de Beauvoir, the adopted daughter of Simone de Beauvoir, was interviewed by Claudia Boulian. And sometimes it's just presentations, so it depends on the sessions. All the sessions have been recorded, so it means that you can watch them online if you're interested. And for that, you can visit directly the website of the Society, where you will find a section dedicated to the Beauvoir Webinar Series. And from there, you'll be able to watch the session on the website or on our YouTube channels as suits you. I just want to remind you that it is possible to join, for you to join the Society. It would be a huge support for us and also for the journal Simone de Beauvoir Studies, because when you become a member of the Society, you also get a subscription to the journal, and members are also registered on our mailing list. And we would love to expand our community, and we will be thrilled to have you join us. You can follow our activities on social media. So we have a Facebook page, we have a Twitter account, and we have a YouTube channel where we share contents. But it's also where our community can express, since you can send us your questions about Beauvoir, you can talk with other specialists. So this is just a way to remind you that the International Simone de Beauvoir Society exists. And the message is that being a member of the Society means being part of a large community of people who are interested in Beauvoir and in her work. So you can join us if you're interested. And it is great to see that the project brings so many people together and allows to share thoughts and knowledge on Beauvoir and beyond, of course. And we are delighted to announce that there will be a Beauvoir webinar series in 2023 too. And we are currently working on the program, which should be ready maybe in December or January, but we will share it online, so stay tuned. By the way, just a small information. The program that we announced at the beginning of this year has slightly changed. We were supposed to have a session in October dedicated to Beauvoir in conversation with Asia, but we had no other choice but to postpone it. We are so sorry. It will likely take place in January or February. So it means that today is the final session of 2022. So now let's come to what brings us together today. Skye Cleary's newest book, How to Be Authentic, Simone de Beauvoir and the Quest for Fulfillment. Skye will be in conversation with Manon Garcia. So welcome, Skye. Congratulations on your book, and we are excited to have you today. I will let Manon introducing Skye. So let me introduce you to Manon. Manon is a philosopher and junior professor of practical philosophy at Freie Universität in Berlin. So sorry for the pronunciation because I can speak German. She's the author of We Are Not Born Submissive, How Patriarchy Shapes Women's Lives. It was first published in French as On ne n'est pas soumise, on le devient by Flammarion in 2018. And she's also the author of La Conversation des Sexes, Philosophie du Consentement, which should be published in English very soon, if I'm not mistaken. Okay. So we had a session on Manon's first book in February, and you can watch it online, like I said earlier. So welcome, Manon. We are delighted to have you today, and thank you for accepting to discuss Skye's book. The floor will be yours during 1 hour and 15 minutes or so, and then the audience can ask questions during 20 minutes or so. So we'll see how it goes. Thank you. Enjoy the session, and Manon, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Marine, and thank you, Gina, for all your work with the Beauvoir Webinar Series that are really amazing and way for us to have this Beauvoirian community, even though I don't attend as much as I would want to, but there's, as we'll see today in the book of Skye, there's only so many things one can do with their life. So it's my pleasure today to talk with Skye Cleary about her latest book. So I think many of you know Skye as she's now one of the important figures in the Beauvoirian world. So Skye is a jack of all trades. She was a lieutenant in the Australian Army Reserves. She worked in international finance, in management consulting, and now she's a philosopher. She writes in many, she's published with the Los Angeles Review of Books, The Independent, The Conversation, The New Republic. I feel like every time there's an exciting book, there's an exciting review from Skye somewhere. And she teaches philosophy at Barnard, if I'm right, or at Columbia, at CUNY, and she gives a lot of conferences and talks. So I'm sure you're already familiar with many of her work, but this is her new book called How to Be Authentic. It's called in American English called How to Be Authentic, Simone de Beauvoir and the Quest for Fulfillment. And I don't want to like use too much of the time, but I think it's a sort of it's both an introduction to Beauvoir's work and life guide that is not self-help, but authenticity help, maybe, but Skye will tell us more about this. I find it to be a very interesting mix of an introduction to Beauvoir's philosophy, a cultural critique, and a memoir. I really appreciated the honesty and the vulnerability that you exposed in there, Skye, and I really felt like the life anecdotes that you used were much more than anecdotes and were a really serious way to make your argument and your reasoning progress. And I will be very interested to hear about how you decided to shape the book the way you did. So, but just to begin, you've been writing about Beauvoir for a while, as I said, under many different forms, books, academic papers, newspaper articles. So could you tell us a bit about how you came to write this book and what you expect or hope that it will do for the readers?
Yeah, thanks, Manon, and thank you for that lovely introduction. Yeah, so I've been trying to find my way in the world because I'm not, I haven't written academic papers so much as, I really found along the way that my greater strength, I guess, is at making philosophy more accessible. And so I guess what I was really hoping is that I could share some of my excitement about Beauvoir and spark more people's interest in, you know, this brilliant thinker. I mean, everybody knows how important she is, of course, but you know, she's still neglected in the canon in many ways. And it's interesting, I've been hearing from readers, and many people said that they had studied philosophy in college, but, you know, never heard of Beauvoir, or just heard of her in very briefly in passing. So as you say, yeah, this is very much an introduction to Beauvoir for, you know, people who may have never read Beauvoir before, or people who might have read The Second Sex, you know, in their teenage years, and but didn't take it further, or people who haven't read her in a long time. And I found authenticity was a really interesting aspect of her philosophy. But how I came across this was, I heard about this word authenticity being splashed around. I mean, it's such a buzzword, right? And it's, and, you know, I'd sometimes ask people, oh, what do you mean by authenticity? And I found I wasn't really getting to the heart of what it was. You know, people would say, oh, it's about being true to yourself, or just being honest and stuff. And I felt like, yeah, okay, these maybe seem to be all part of it, but I didn't have a good grasp on what authenticity really was. And it started to really annoy me. So I was frustrated and wanted to understand what this thing was that everyone was talking about. And I'd read enough of Beauvoir to know that she had at least spoken about it. So my PhD was on existentialism and romantic love. And one of the chapters was on Beauvoir, and I knew she had been talking about authentic love. And so I wanted to explore like this concept of authenticity in a broader way, and deeper way. And I wanted to kind of go beyond that cliched, you know, finding yourself narrative, and show how Beauvoir's philosophy can be relevant to thinking about our lives today, and how her philosophy matters. And that's, as you say, one of the reasons why, yes, there was philosophy in there, but I also wanted to draw on stories from her life, and, you know, a few from my life, and other people's lives, with their permission, of course. But I wanted to, yeah, share my excitement with more general audiences. And so this is, as you know, you sort of alluded to the notion that this isn't like a classic academic book, but it's not a super popular book either. It's sort of in that realm in between, which I think, you know, we are not born submissive. Manon was seemed to be there too. Like, yes, it was rigorously academic, but it was also like trying to open up this thinking to a much broader audience. But correct me if I'm wrong.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think that's what Boba was trying to do also. And so that's something that I find interesting in thinking what part of this endeavor is yours, and what part is showing in doing what it is that she was doing. Or at least that's what I also wonder about myself and my own work. So it's not, so I don't know, have you thought about this?
Are you saying, have I thought about like how these different lives and ideas are intertwined? So.
No, I mean about this idea of making philosophy accessible, using those real life examples to say something about what philosophy is. It seems to me that this is what she does. And so in my own work, since you were talking about my book, I wonder a lot about, is it my idea to try to make philosophy accessible and make her work accessible, or am I just a Beauvoirian enough that I'm redoing what she does?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So, I mean, I think Beauvoir, yeah, she was certainly trying to do this, but, you know, she certainly wasn't the first. I think, you know, Kierkegaard was talking about, you know, rehabilitating the personal, passionate, subjective experience. And yeah, so I think there are, I mean, of course, there are lots of different ways of philosophizing, but I think, you know, Beauvoir's way of putting herself in her work, or at least publishing, you know, her letters and diaries, and you know, telling her life stories through novels, as well as, you know, philosophically. I think, I mean, I was inspired by that, but I think, you know, we can add our own, I guess, flavor and our own you know, shapes to different things, and that's part of the creative process, you know, building on what these brilliant people have done before us, and you know, applying it to our own lives, or applying it to our own times in new way, and thinking how it's relevant, or how, you know, some things aren't so relevant anymore. And yeah, I think that's a process of creativity.
Yeah, I agree. No, but and it's interesting because you're saying you're not really writing academic papers, but I said that because I have a very vivid memory of reading your chapter on love in Beauvoir for my book a while ago, and feeling like it was really scholarship on Beauvoir, a very academic scholarship, and substantially different from what you're doing in this book. So I've been very interested by the way you really stew together the philosophical analysis, the personal anecdotes, and the cultural critique in your book. And I'm sure that this method comes from your views about what it means to do existentialist philosophy. So can you tell us a bit more about the method itself?
Yeah, and I mean, I was, yeah, as I said, inspired by Beauvoir. I mean, in her student diary, she says, and this is the epigraph to my book, you know, she says, my philosophy must be from life. And, you know, she also talks about how, you know, every living step is a philosophical choice. So these kind of statements really resonated with me. And, you know, certainly through some of my philosophical education, you know, I was taught that, you know, focusing too heavily on autobiography can be an ad hominem fallacy, which, yeah, I agree with that. But when we're talking about, you know, the human condition, you know, context matters. And this is what I think the existential kind of tradition is trying to reinvigorate, you know, this subjective experience. And, you know, as Nietzsche said, oh, philosophy is autobiography, or what do you say, in the Philosopher, there's nothing impersonal whatsoever. And so I've kind of come around to the thinking that it's really important to give context in order to think about what problems people were trying to solve, what their intentions were, what questions they had, and the kind of choices they were making. And so basically the perspective they were coming from. And I was certainly inspired by Beauvoir and Kierkegaard and others, and also I've seen more modern philosophers write or think about, you know, philosophy in this way, like John Cagg and Gordon Marino and Massimo Pilucci. They're all pulling together like philosophy and talking about it through personal experience. Which can be very dangerous. You know, as you said, it's a vulnerable thing to do, and so it was actually quite terrifying for me. But I mean, so far, most people have said that those kind of personal stories was not just enjoyable, but also kind of helped them grasp some of the ideas, or get their head around the ideas in more concrete ways. So this isn't a memoir, but there are kind of memoir elements to it. And I think this does resonate with Beauvoir's philosophy, or maybe inspired by it. It's, you know, putting yourself out there in the world and saying, it's like this for me, or, you know, is it like this for you? Do you see anything of yourself in it? Or even if you don't, does it provide a different perspective or understanding in the world? And so it's kind of a way, at least I found when I read this kind of philosophy written in this way, that it's, you know, a little bit of a way to, I guess, access some of the nuances, or it's a way of engaging the reader in conversation. I think at least that's what I found when I was reading this. And of course, the risk is that you end up kind of going into, you know, self-indulgence. And that was one of the things Beauvoir criticized a lot of women writers for, is self-indulgence. And so I mean, I tried to use stories where I thought they could illuminate something of Beauvoir's philosophy, or where I had learned about Beauvoir's philosophy and sort of thought about this experience in retrospect. And it helped me understand kind of what was going on. But also what was interesting with this perspective was when it was the proposal was being sent out to publishers, you know, there was certainly one publisher that wanted just the philosophy and no personal stories, but, you know, the others sort of liked the personal stories. And, you know, so I sort of came to this decision early on, you know, do I want, like, where do I want this book to go? Do I want it to be personal, which is the scary road, or do I want to like keep it very sort of philosophical? And that seemed like the easier road to me, but you know, and that was a factor in the decision. I was like, no, I want to do this. I want to push myself a little bit in this new way and see what comes of it.
Yeah, that's yeah, thank you. That's very interesting, because I actually think that you do exactly what you describe, of saying this is how it is for me, how is it for you. But in my impression, but maybe we disagree on this, is that Boba absolutely doesn't do that. Boba has a quite old school, some people would say manly way of saying this is how the world is, and this is and my way to see the world is the right way to see the world. And I feel like that's not exactly what you do. So is it something yeah, that really matters for you, this difference? Is this difference also grounded on the criticisms of Beauvoir that you talk about in your book, and that you realized what was problematic in her way of doing philosophy as well, that you distance yourself from?
Yeah, so I think you're right. You know, I mean, Beauvoir certainly did sort of separate sort of the formal philosophy from her other writing, but I mean, she did kind of infuse herself, if I don't know if that's the right word, but or put herself into a lot of her writing, which is why she started writing the autobiographies or memoirs, and publishing her letters and diaries and novels, sort of, you know, loosely based on her life. And I think there are works, like I was thinking, A Very Easy Death seems to, you know, go into this realm a little more, like combining, you know, her personal experience with, you know, thinking about death. But, you know, I think there was an element in there of me trying to reconcile her different methods. And someone said to me a long time ago that if you're not sure what to write or which direction to write, then just write all of it. Like, free yourself from what you think you're supposed to write, and see what comes of that process. And so it's almost a way of finding the method as you go along, and you might create something new from there. And that really stuck with me. And in fact, Beauvoir does say something in, I think it's the second sex, I don't have the quote handy, but something like, you know, taking a creative process is like taking the facts and transcending beyond the facts of what you're supposed to be doing. And so, you know, maybe even though she didn't explicitly go there, like merging that's personal with the philosophical in an explicit way, I think she was still thinking that way. And, you know, there is a lot of philosophy in her autobiographies and novels, so and letters, that she was trying to work out philosophical ideas So yeah, and I didn't feel the need to copy exactly what Beauvoir did. As I said, this was very much inspired by Beauvoir.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying you are, but what I meant is that you invite the others more in your writing than she did. That there's constantly a question to the reader in your writing that was not there, or not as explicitly, I think, in her work. But just to finish on that, I wanted to ask more specifically about the first person, because I find it very interesting and important that in the second sex, Beauvoir tries to use the first person as little as possible, or tries to use a sort of myriad of first persons. That in a way, I think it's a distance that she takes from phenomenology, that she says, well, my I is not the only I that matters, and here are memoirs of other people, and she tries to do this sort of constellation of I's. But in your book, there is this very strong I that I find very interesting, and it made me think. So in France, there's this feminist theorist called Camille Froide-Vaumetry, who published a book last year in which she also offers a reading of Beauvoir through narrating important events of her life and her experience. For instance, she talks a lot about Beauvoir's philosophy of the body and her own anorexia, and how that worked together. And so I really wondered, how is it that two philosophers who are deeply influenced by Beauvoir in the same 2 years write about their personal life with Boba in this very interesting, similar intricacy of the personal and the political and the philosophical. So I was wondering if you have come up with hypotheses on the reason why Beauvoir did not do the same as you do. Is it, and that in your way of doing it, is it, as you were saying, a way to reconcile Beauvoir's memoirs with Beauvoir's explicitly philosophical works? Or, yeah, I wanted to hear a bit more about the first person, and then I promise we'll stop talking about it.
Yeah. And yeah, so it's, there is a strong I in here in my book, but it's not only me. And that's one of the reasons I did pull on, stories from Beauvoir's life and other people's lives who I know. And I think, Beauvoir tended to put that sort of thing in her novels, I think. And I don't know why there was I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts are about why she didn't do it. But it seems, there are more people doing it. So why, there seems to be something about Beauvoir's philosophy that lends itself to that kind of thinking, to put us in the position of challenging our own thoughts. But I don't know, Manon, do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think she would have been even more punished for doing so than she already was. And I think she could not speak in the first person in the second sex, even if she wanted to, because already she was accused of showing her private parts to the entire world when she was very careful not to do so. And I think it's also a sign of the progress that feminism has brought to the world, that it's now possible to talk about this that openly, and to really question what it is to be a woman in the first person. And I was very moved by your vulnerability at some points in the book about motherhood, about, well, it's probably because I'm also a young mother, so it felt very, very, very too familiar. But I think saying this 70 years ago would have meant destruction. It would have been unbearable for the world to hear. And so I think that's part of the reason. But I'm not sure she would have wanted to do that. I'm not sure she was interested necessarily in that form of authenticity, in the vulnerable authenticity in that way. So that's also one way maybe to think about authenticity, but I don't know. But I'm gonna, that's gonna lead me to my next question. That is probably my only oppositional question, because I really appreciated the effort you made in your book to respond and take seriously the very valid objections made, for instance, by Black feminists to the second sex, and your honesty about flaws about the second sex. And like, I felt like you really engaged with in an authentic way about this. Yet I was a bit surprised because there's a moment where you wrote the following quote that I'm going to read, where you say, feminism has not sufficiently acknowledged the structures that thwart success. It has widened the intersectional gap between the privileged and the exploited, and it pays only lip service to collective justice and equality. I felt like this seems like a very strong attack against feminism. So I was wondering if you really think that.
It does sound like a strong attack when you pull it out like that. And I mean, I was very much, I'll say, very much influenced by Meryl Altman's book, where she sort of addresses this. And I sort of that really helped me put kind of the intersectional critiques in context. And, you know, I think what I'm talking about there is how feminism of the past has, you know, benefited, you know, the more privileged. And, you know, sure, feminism is definitely making progress in general, but there are also still gaps. You know, Black women are still paid significantly less than white women on average, and Black mothers are still really poorly treated in the medical system, at least in the US. And I think Beauvoir, I was talking about this in a section where I was talking about how, you know, how can women have it all? And I thought this was, you know, Beauvoir, you know, mentions it kind of in I think it's Misunderstanding in Moscow, how she says, you know, there are career women, you know, people who are, you know, want to work, but they also want to make sure they stay healthy and work out, and yet they're also expected to do housekeeping and rear children. And she's like, so she was talking about the double day and the second shift, and anticipating all these challenges that women were going to have. And said, you know, it's going to be impossible for women to do it well. And she's like, how do women manage it? Well, her comment in Misunderstanding in Moscow is that, well, they spread themselves too thinly. Like, it's a real challenge. And so these are some of the pressures that Beauvoir foresaw, and that feminism is trying to resolve. But of course, feminism isn't a perfect movement, and I think it's important for all of us to be sort of attuned to these kind of shortcomings and keep working towards transforming society and keeping constructively critical about what we're doing and making sure that we're being inclusive.
No, I think we agree, but I think saying that feminism pays only lip service to collective justice and equality felt a bit, because I think you could say that there is a branch of super liberal feminism, the sort of leaning empowerment feminism that does that, but the Black feminists are feminists. And so I felt like this was a bit, but it's really a detail that I wanted to hear exactly, because I wasn't sure. I tend to agree with her quote in the Malentendu at Moscou. So I was interested to see what you thought about it. And also, it's very interesting. Do you know that interview between Betty Frieden and Boba? Because I completely randomly saw this. So if other people here don't know about it, it's really very funny because Betty Frieden went to interview Beauvoir. She was sent by Now to talk to Boba about how can we have it all. And at that time, Boba was really deep in her Maoist phase. And she was very mean to Betty Friedan about how stupid it was to want to be a mother at the same time as everything. And it was, so I think she even changed her views about this at different times in her life. But anyway, thank you. Yeah, that was a very interesting response. Thank you. So now a sort of different question, but when opening your book, a Beauvoirian reader can help to be surprised with the structure, which is in certain way very similar to the second sex structure, while being markedly different. So could you tell us what led you to organize the book the way you did, and why the differences, why the similarities, like how, because I think it helps us understand maybe better the project stuck in existential terms.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of the second sex, and I appreciate her structure in terms of starting out with facts and myths, and looking at kind of the infrastructure of our lives. And then she, of course, went on and looked at kind of specific situations, different phases and different stages of life, but not everybody's life. But I found that a really useful way to think about the challenges and opportunities that we face, especially in terms of authenticity. And so I think so first of all, I just found that lent itself well to, like, as a rough structure in which to analyze. But also, I've got other chapters, and for example, happiness. I mean, Beauvoir didn't talk explicitly or much about happiness specifically in the second sex, or it wasn't a theme, and she tried to kind of focus on freedom. But at the same time, happiness was, like an ongoing underlying theme in some of her work. And so I think I wanted to kind of pay homage to Beauvoir's sort of structure, but also bring, my own voice to it, and think about, and also update Beauvoir in some ways. Look at where we are sort of trapped in this hedonic treadmill of consumerism, and think about that, and self-sabotage and narcissism and rebellion and I wanted to sort of expand on those areas that I thought were relevant to today. And of course, you can't, I mean, Beauvoir's work is, so there's so much there, right? And so, like you said earlier, we can't cover everything. So I wanted to, draw out, first of all, the things that resonated most with me, but also give that sort of strong philosophical grounding to the discussion, and then go into kind of the different situations.
Okay, thank you. I found very interesting, to me at least, that you mentioned the difference of reception of Beauvoir between France and the US, and the fact that in the US some men like Hansberry really valued her work and saw her as a philosopher. Where do you think this comes from? Is it just a result of partially, or is it something more?
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that, whether it was because of partially or not, but well, Lorraine Hansberry, she was a woman, but she wrote about how she saw American men viewing or perceiving the second sex. But Beauvoir, she attacks men for being oppressive, but also women for being complicit. And I think that can be a jagged pill to swallow. I mean, there are certainly men who want to understand the situation. And, although Beauvoir, of course, didn't focus so much on men in the second sex, she does say how women's situation ties men or binds men to oppressive masculine ideals too. And what I thought was interesting is that, with my book, I thought that a book written by a woman, me, about a woman, Beauvoir, and I thought mostly for women, would appeal mostly to women, but it's been really interesting and inspiring about how many men have also been interested in this perspective. And I know we have some of the translators of the best version of the second sex here, so maybe in the chat we can talk to them about their perspective. But Manon, can I hear your perspective as well on that?
No, I because of course it's a question that I ask myself a lot, and so I was wondering if part of the reason was that because partially took off all the things that he found uninteresting, which was 20 to 25% of the second sex. So maybe those pages were actually the ones that annoyed the men the most, and therefore were deemed, the second sex was deemed less annoying by men. So I was wondering if that was, I hadn't really thought about this. I just thought about this when reading your book. And, but also I feel like maybe it comes from the sort of myth of the French woman in the US, that it's, that she came with the aura of being French, whereas in France, she just came with the downside of being a woman, because they didn't care that she was French. And so, it's like Baldwin was not as Black in France as he was in the US. Maybe Beauvoir was not as much of a woman in the US as she was in France. Something like that. I wondered if you had views about that.
What's interesting is the Lorraine Hansberry piece. It's actually an unfinished piece. Unfortunately, she passed away.
Oh,
so
really?
Maybe she would have given us more insights. But I'm convinced by your analysis, and I think that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean it's just hypothesis, of course, but so now let's maybe talk about your main concept, authenticity. So to begin with, can you tell us why this is the concept that is the most important in your view? I feel like you explained already from a personal perspective that you were annoyed that it is such a buzzword that people use. I don't know how you say this in English, à tort et à travers. So in all the possible ways, but never the exact right way. But also, what do you think authenticity plays? Is it really the key to her philosophy? Can you tell us a bit about the concept?
Yeah, definitely. So it's definitely an important concept. I'm still thinking about whether it's the most important. I'm not sure. I'm going to stop short of saying it's the most important. But yeah, I mean, so in the way I'm using authenticity is that it's a process of creating our essence. So meaning that it's a way of expressing our freedom to become who we choose, while also acknowledging that we're not radically free, because there are facts of our lives that we can't choose. And so, yeah, normally authenticity is taken to mean, introspecting, to find your true self. But, in Beauvoir's view of authenticity is that no, authenticity is a creative process. It's not like something, static or some kind of blueprint inside you that you need to find, but rather it's a more forward-looking outwards process. And why it's important? Well, to be human is to stretch beyond our given situations. And so if we can't do that, or if we're not allowed, or if we're prevented from kind of stretching in ways that we choose for ourselves, then that's like that's like metaphysical malnutrition. We get stuck in immanence, where we're starving our transcendence. We're starving that kind of part of our being that reaches beyond the facts of our lives. And so, the problem with that is we're if we go back to existence precedes essence, we're just existing and we're not creating our essence, or our essence is someone else's creation. And so the risk of not transcending and not orienting ourselves in authentic ways is to risk being a passive object and not being an agent of our own life.
Thank you. That's great. Well, I mean, that was a great summary. So more specifically, so in your chapter on friendship, that I found very interesting, you claim that a friendship doesn't have to be reciprocal to be authentic. And you take the example of Beauvoir's friendship to Zaza that you see as maybe the paradigmatic example of authentic friendship. It struck me because I've always thought of it, especially and even more so since Les Inséparables, as a fake friendship, given how unbalanced it was. It almost it sounded to me like those teenage loves, really, where you project a lot on someone, and it's unreciprocated love, and so it can play a big role in your life because you look at this person and you want to love the same things as them, so you learn so much, and this sort of very active way to love the other without the other really being authentically there in the picture. And for me in Les Inséparables, it was even stronger because it did look like one of those teenage real loves, that she really loved her, not so much that she wanted to have sex with her and things like that, but she was very possessive. She was very or at least in the version of them in Les Inséparables, she was very jealous, very and so I was very interested that we disagree about this, and that I may very well be wrong. So could you maybe tell us what makes it a paradigmatic, authentic relationship in your view?
Yeah, so I think what I was arguing was that relationships, sure, there needs to be some kind of reciprocity there, but it doesn't necessarily have to be in the same ways. So I was talking about how that relationship between Beauvoir and Zaza was asymmetrical, but I'm not sure that, I would argue that asymmetrical doesn't necessarily mean a fake relationship. So my relationship with my son is extremely asymmetrical. It doesn't make it fake. Relationships between professors and students, asymmetrical, but not fake. And I think we're missing out if we automatically dismiss connections as unequal. I think inequalities in relationships come up here. But it depends how we're talking, what are we talking about with this asymmetry or inequality. And Beauvoir got a lot out of the friendship with Zaza. She says it was the most interesting thing that ever happened to her. And Zaza said that, yeah, Beauvoir was her best school friend, but of course, in the grand scheme of things, that didn't necessarily, Zaza was distracted with family and music and boyfriends and other things. But I think if we put it in the context, okay, so Beauvoir's childhood. So they met at what, age 9, I think. And, you know, through Beauvoir's teenage years, she talked about how her parents were patronizing and condescending, and her mother dismissed most of what she said as absurd. And Zaza really challenged Beauvoir to see her life in new ways and exciting ways. And Beauvoir found a lot of happiness and self-confidence through that relationship that she didn't get from her parents. And Beauvoir says that, you know, love isn't envy. And she said, I could think of nothing better in the world than being myself and loving Zaza. But certainly, as you pointed out, there were some jealousies there, and there was a cost to that difference in feelings, such as Beauvoir being hurt that she didn't know why Zaza and Merleau-Ponty broke up. But in The Second Sex, Beauvoir talks about how for friendship to be authentic, it must first be free. So I think what she's saying is that, yeah, of course, there must be some kind of reciprocity for there to be a relationship in the first place. But how that reciprocity manifests is often, you know, unequal. Beauvoir wasn't demanding that Zaza feel the same way about her, and Zaza wasn't exploiting Beauvoir's feelings. But I think one way to reconcile this is to think about Beauvoir's idea of intersubjectivity. So intersubjectivity meaning kind of a mutual respect and recognition of one another's freedom. And when you start demanding things like reciprocity of time or attention or of feelings, then that can become a tyranny in the friendship. But if you're saying, no, the friendship has to be exactly equal, or I'm going to walk away from it, well, I think we're missing out on valuable connections there too. And, you know, my reading of the friendship was that it was meaningful for both of them. You know, they had these amazing conversations and challenged each other's ideas and complained about their parents. And, you know, Beauvoir said that it was her friendship with Zaza that sort of inspired her thinking on connecting with other people, and she says something like it kind of sparked her to give importance to kind of a union of two human beings, of you know, exploring the world together and, you know, finding meaning in each other's existence. And she says feeling is free when it doesn't depend on any outside command, and when it's lived in sincerity and without fear. And so my reading is that she was allowing Zaza's feelings to be free. She's like, it's okay if you don't feel the same way about me. But there's also, I mean, think about when they were 21, just before, you know, when Zaza was dying. You know, it's interesting that there was sort of a reciprocity that came about then. You know, Zaza told Beauvoir how actually you helped me cope with my feelings of being lost and abandoned during those teenage years. And Zaza was apologized to Beauvoir for being the cause of her suffering. And so there was kind of that appreciation later on. And so I think when we go back and talk about the intersubjectivity and like the freedom of feelings, and making sure that it's based on intersubjectivity and not like kind of an exploitation or manipulation, then that kind of attachment can be authentic. I mean, it's not always authentic, but it can be if those feelings are free.
That's very interesting. Thank you. Because I think I agree with everything you said. But I think it's just that when you say this friendship is authentic, I look at it from the perspective of the friendship, from sort of objective perspective of the friendship. And you look at it from the existential authenticity of Beauvoir. And there's no doubt that Beauvoir is 100% there. She's aware that Zaza is not giving back as much as she's giving. She's fine with that. She respects who Zaza is. There's a lot of respect for Zaza in the love she gives to Zaza. My worry is more that Zaza doesn't see Beauvoir, and that therefore, can we talk about an authentic friendship when, because you talk about this in your book, when the person you see as your friend doesn't necessarily count you as their friend. Or I found this statistic that you gave, I don't remember exactly the numbers, but terrifying, that, what is it, 30% of your friends,
I think it's closer to 50, yeah.
50% of people you consider your friends don't consider you their friend. It's really the worst nightmare. But can there be an authentic relationship between two people if they think it's really not the same relationship? Like, can you authentically behave? Can you authentically have a relationship with a colleague if this colleague thinks you're their best friend? You know, like, so that was my question. Is authenticity necessarily an existential individual thing, or can we talk about a relationship as authentic to say something else than just what the person we're looking at is putting into it? Maybe that's too technical, but I just
Yeah, no, I mean, at the core of it is the notion of intersubjectivity, and as long as there's that mutual recognition of respect, and I'm just wondering, like, what you're saying about if I call someone my best friend, but I'm not necessarily their best friend, can we still be friends? I mean, I would say yes. And I would, as long as I'm still there's still that respect between us. But one of the other ways that I think, or frameworks that we can sort of draw upon for this, is thinking about being for ourselves and being for others. And both were important dimensions of our existence for Beauvoir. Being all for ourselves is kind of dangerous because it's very individualistic and we end up self-centered and narcissistic. But being for others entirely is also dangerous because we become beholden to what other people want us to be. And of course, for Beauvoir, it's a constant tension to manage this in between, this sort of being with others. But I think, just because you're not at exactly the same point on that spectrum doesn't necessarily invalidate the entire relationship. But if it does tip too far, one way or the other, I know I'm oversimplifying the concept here, but if it's like, Beauvoir finds herself constantly being, torn by, Zaza not paying her enough attention or not giving her the time that she really wanted, then if Beauvoir stayed in that kind of friendship, then that's would have been Beauvoir being kind of submissive and giving up too much of herself for this obsession, if that's what you wanted to call it. But I think Beauvoir kind of managed this tension, even if she did slide sometimes into one of the extremes. But and also Zaza seems to have respected her. And in those moments that they did have together, I mean, they were really intimate, intellectually vulnerable moments that they had together. I mean, they told each other like incredible secrets. So I guess I can see in Beauvoir's position how much she was getting out of that relationship. And I think maybe even the fact that it was there were inequalities in their feelings might even highlight Beauvoir's philosophy more about what it means to be authentic and respect other people's attitudes and positions and feelings.
That's very interesting. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. And what about does it change something if it's love and not just friendship? Because I feel like maybe a lot of people would be ready to agree with you, and then they judge Beauvoir harshly for having agreed to the contingent love pact, and people say, oh yeah, like she was so jealous of older partners of Sartre, and but it looks to me that even if we were, and I'm not sure I agree with this view, to think that she would have preferred a not morganatic marriage, and she would have preferred for them to be monogamous, which I don't think it's right. But even so, wouldn't it be an authentic way to love someone to say, well, he wants that, and I love him, and like it doesn't make a relationship inauthentic that he has other lovers, and that I'm sometimes really torn about this. And I feel like there's something in l'invité about this. And do you think it makes a difference?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's hard to generalize in this way. I'm just thinking though.
Sorry, I'm just I'm just discussing with you.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's, you know, you're right. It's similar in a way to, you know, if you were to take the perspective that, you know, Beauvoir didn't want this relationship to be, you know, open, and, you know, was actually really hurt and was hiding it from everybody, then you would be like, well, yeah, that's inauthentic, because she'd be misrepresenting herself, misrepresenting her feelings, and, you know, being submissive to Sartre's desires. So I think in that sense, yeah, I don't think you could call that authentic anymore. But you know, I'm also hesitant to make that assumption about Beauvoir. You know, she said many times that her life was freely lived, and, you know, she actively chose to be in that relationship. And some people even argue that, you know, it was her idea in the first place. And, you know, in her student diary, she was already talking about, you know, the travesty of just marrying off to one person forever. So, you know, it wasn't, so I don't think that it was just, you know, Sartre imposing his ideas on her. I think she was an active participant and thinking about this. But it doesn't mean that, you know, authenticity isn't for Beauvoir something that you achieve. Fine, we have an authentic relationship, we're done. No, it's authenticity is a dynamic thing that we always need to be negotiating and thinking about the different nuances of the situations, and this tension between being for ourselves and being for others. And whether that's in friendship or love or another kind of relationship. Yeah, and there will be times when we do, you know, focus on being for others instead of being for ourselves, or vice versa. But that, just because there are times like having kids, like, you know, like it's so much being for the child, but that doesn't invalidate, you know, an authentic relationship, and knowing that, you know, what, you know, it was my choice to have a child, and I'm, you know, living that choice, and you know, nurturing a child to, you know, seize their own freedom in ways. So I think there are really, that formula for how you create an authentic relationship is complex, and it's always going to be in tension. And I think Beauvoir was really attuned to that tension, but we're always continuing to make choices about these relationships, and about whether this is the kind of world we want to create for ourselves, and the kind of relationship we choose to be in. But it's going to be, I think, an agreement between, you know, two or more people. And I think Beauvoir appreciated that.
Thank you. I also really enjoyed the distinction you make in the chapter on self-sabotage between living authentically and the whole like self-love thing that we hear about all the time now. And so can you tell us a bit more about this? Why is self-love? Because we're made to believe that self-love is the top authentic way to be right now. Like, this is who I am, and I love myself. And so can you tell us about this?
Yeah, and I mean, I'm not writing off self-love altogether.
No, of course, yeah.
Yeah, it can. I think what I'm arguing is that it can be problematic when it devolves into narcissism, like when it is, focusing on being for yourself, loving yourself at the expense of this other dimension, being with others. And of course, Beauvoir has a chapter in the Second Sex on narcissism, and how, narcissism is an existential response, because it's an escape from facing up to the task of creating our own worth and creating our own values. But it's also, it's not necessarily, it's partly an individual thing, but it's partly a social thing. It's a strategy to cope with being in a world that doesn't value us. And so narcissism is the process of objectifying yourself, and then loving that image of yourself, and trying to, I'm thinking about Instagram or whatever here, trying to create that, cohesive, portrait of who is our essential being. But of course, Beauvoir's problem is that, fine, we create this, image of ourselves, and then we're subordinating ourselves to this image, and we're alienating ourselves from ourselves. So it's a crisis of character. And she advised that we would do better to keep holding ourselves in question and appreciate that our being is fragmentary and ever evolving, and try and be comfortable with this ambiguous existence that we are, and avoid sliding just too heavily into this kind of the narcissistic manifestation of self-love.
Thank you. Very interesting. But that's a more general question, I guess. But throughout the book, you manage and quite masterfully, because I've been trying to do this, and it's really hard, to make Beauvoir's different works enter into a productive dialogue. And you said earlier that you think there's as much philosophy in her memoirs and in her novels as in her philosophical works, and I tend to agree with you. So I found this incredibly useful, but I have a question about this method. It's not an objection, it's a real question that I ask myself a lot lately. Do you think we can read all of Beauvoir's works as if they were written by the same Beauvoir? So of course, like, we're among Beauvoirians here, so we know of this whole question of, is there one big question in Beauvoir's writing and life? And probably so. Like, the Peg Simmons was talking about how Beauvoir suddenly said the other is my question, and the relationship between the subject and the other is my question. And I think Kate's biography is a good argument for that. So there are reasons to think that she's interested in the same questions, but can we think that l'invité and la femme rompue can dialogue with each other as if Beauvoir had held the same views during the 25 years that separate them? Is the Beauvoir from Pierce and Cinéas the same Beauvoir as the Beauvoir from La Vieillesse? Like, what do we do about this?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with you that we can't assume that it was the same, Beauvoir, because she was, we all grow and evolve and change our minds on various things. But I do think it's interesting to, like, pull out different ideas from different sources and compare and contrast and look for threads. And I do talk about how, I mean, I think at one point in Beauvoir's student diary, she's like saying how she believes that, something like marriage is the pinnacle of happiness or something. And we all know, she changed her mind on that. And, she was less interested in politics until sort of World War II, and then became very, very active. And, I love that story about her and Simone Weil, how, Simone at the Sorbonne, Beauvoir was interested in, said she was interested in finding meaning in life, and Simone Weil was like, oh, it's obvious you've never gone hungry. So, and it took Beauvoir a while to kind of incorporate that more communal perspective. And so I guess my approach with it was, I would say probably The Second Sex was the key text that I drew on. But also I looked a lot at the interviews after The Second Sex, and I think that Jurassic interview, The Second Sex 25 years later, so really drawing on, okay, well, how were her ideas changing, and drawing on novels to see where philosophical ideas that she'd addressed in The Second Sex or elsewhere were kind of popping up as examples, and where I could kind of use examples from her novels to tie to some of her philosophical points, or look at through her philosophical lens. And I think also When Things of the Spirit Come First was a really interesting one, written so early on, about case studies in what I think is bad faith, but then it was published so much later. So thinking about how her kind of germinating ideas about inauthenticity. So I don't think we should limit ourselves, but I think you're right. It's important to kind of take that into consideration.
Thank you. Relating to this question, I think I'm sure that my favorite chapter of your book is your last chapter on rebellion. I think it's really fantastic on many levels. I loved especially the list of mystifications, loved how it can be read as a debunking of all the worst ideas of the time. Loved how you really carefully intertwine very detailed analysis of Beauvoir with cultural critique and engagement with other important thinkers. But it left me wondering about the possibility of existential individualism. And I think it's probably the problem for Boba herself, right? At the end of The Second Sex, it looks like nothing will change without a durable and complete social change. And yet, everything we've done so far was looking from the perspective of the individual, right? And so suddenly I wondered, isn't it a bit inauthentically self-centered to focus on being authentic?
I love that question. Yeah. I think it's more a deep tension in human existence. I mean, Beauvoir was pushing back against radical individualism and the notion that authenticity is only an individual endeavor. And sure, if you take authenticity in this superficial sense of, oh, it's all about me and self-love, like we were talking about, then it would absolutely be a problem. But that's not what Beauvoir's existentialism was about, and it wasn't what her idea of authenticity was about. I think it's in her essay, What is Existentialism? She defines at least her version of existentialism as a philosophy based on the idea that the individual's the reason and source of values, and also our lives only take on meaning through engaging in the world and other people. So this coexistence is such a core part of our being. So authenticity is this process of creating a reason for being, creating our essence, setting self-chosen goals, but also respecting that other people are doing the same. And this is where I went to the ethics of ambiguity, because that was where she talked about, well, how do we avoid this individualistic kind of anything goes attitude? And it's where she tried to take existentialism in an ethical direction, with especially, and core to this, I think, is this concept of intersubjectivity, like recognizing that other people's lives and choices matter as much as mine. And we have to take other people into account because we coexist, because we're abandoned on Earth, we share the same human condition, and we're relational beings, and we're bound to one another, we're bound to our environment, and we're responsible for one another because of this coexistence. So I guess the question is, do you agree with Beauvoir that is, it's an ambiguous ethics, as she says, but I think that, if we accept that, other people's freedom is the foundation of my freedom, then we accept that authenticity isn't an individual endeavor. And I think we need to acknowledge that. And that's why I love Beauvoir so much on this, because she takes authenticity away from this selfish kind of introspection and shifts it towards a future, communally oriented kind of concept.
Okay, thank you. But then, so sorry, I'm pushing a little bit more, because I both liked and kind of opposed the passage where you said these were the two big mistakes of Boba, her position on pedophilia and her position on Maoism, because of course, like, she would probably respond, it's a question of how you produce your values and how can we judge what positions of hers were good and bad. And the Maoism position, I think she kind of kept, probably until she died, some sort of version of this position. And it is a deeply anti-individual position. And so this is part of my, also this circles back to my worry about treating her as someone who had consistent views all throughout her life, because I think at the point where she becomes a Maoist, she becomes really intolerant of people's individual quests, and that's the core of her fight with Frieden. I think she's just annoyed with Frieden, and so she's being particularly not nice. But she tells her, like, you Americans, you're all about like, I want to raise my kids. Kids should just be produced outside of society, and motherhood is terrible. Like, she's very, I think she does it on purpose. Again, like I think she goes further than what she believes, but she's in this whole idea of a complete collectivist society, and that seems in such a sharp tension with her existentialism, that this is something that I don't know what is left of her existentialism at that point. And I wonder if we should see the second sex. I think more and more that the second sex is some sort of an existential turn for her, where she becomes a socialist in writing it. She becomes a feminist in writing it. But is she still really an existentialist at the end? It's a question. It's an open question, but I would be interested to hear what you think about this.
Yeah, I mean, I don't remember the details of that interview.
No. Yeah, no, but more generally.
Yeah, I mean, of course, she was, did end up at the second sex, saying that, yeah, we can do what we can individually, but, we need a transformation in society. And I think she still, she said she held out hope for socialism, but realized that socialism was just as, sexist that capitalist societies were just as sexist as socialist societies and vice versa. So that wasn't going to solve the issue. But I mean, if she left her existential behind, I mean, I think what I'm focusing on in this book is her existential writings in particular, and looking at that. So I'm not sure if I can speak to whether she renounced that at the end of her life.
Yeah. No, but I'm not sure. Even before it, I'm not saying. I'm really not saying that you're wrong or that she's not an existentialist, but I feel like by finishing the chapter, your book on a chapter on rebellion, that is also the conclusion of your book, you're taking this tension very seriously. And that's what I really like about this chapter, is that there is a huge tension between even her concept of intersubjectivity and her idea that the social structure matters so much in a certain way. And that I think you're right that the idea of rebellion is a way to try to sew them back together. But I just wanted to hear you talk about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think she acknowledges that there are these tensions. I mean, it's why the ethics are ambiguous, but, and acknowledging that, the connections between people are always going to be fragile and precarious, and there are no easy answers to navigate being with others. But I think it comes back to her idea of, and something that she only sort of vaguely alluded to at the end of the second sex, but then went pretty heavily into activism to use her position of privilege to open up freedoms for other people. And I see that as being based on her idea of intersubjectivity, which really, I mean, it's just about being friendlier with people, like trying to form more reciprocal and cooperative and constructive relationships, instead of having this society which we have now and have had for so long based on domination and oppression. So I think she was a bit utopian in that way, sure, but of course, what else are we going to do? And there's always going to be this tension between the individual and society. But I think I appreciate that she held out hope for that and saw that there could be a better world. And in fact, she says that is the task of feminism, to recreate the foundations of the world on freedom instead of domination. And she said that, I think that was in her interview, one of the interviews, 25 years after the second sex. And yeah.
Okay, thank you, Skye. I think I don't have any more questions, but maybe it's the right time to take questions from the audience. I think we have one already from William, where he says, the idea of happiness does not translate well from Greek to English. Don't you think it is more like eudaimonia? In French, bonheur is closer in meaning the happiness, which is meaningless. Should Beauvoir only be read in French?
Yeah, so just and in my book I do kind of look at more eudaimonia as well, and think about life going well and the flourishing that comes with living in harmony in the world. But I do think Beauvoir was still you know, this idea of happiness, if you read her diaries and her letters, like it's still like it's a recurring theme that she realized that it was kind of a receding goal, but she was still it seemed to be a question she kept asking herself. And I think, and what I conclude in my book is that it, you know, this kind of well-being is a side effect of orienting ourselves in authentic ways. So embracing our freedom, taking responsibility for our lives, you know, creating connections with other people and the world, and creating a kind of harmony as much as we can. But that harmony, she says, harmony is never a given. You know, we need to embrace the ambiguity and you know, accept those tensions. And she says, you know, I experience these tensions as a triumph. And so as to whether Beauvoir should only be read in French, is that the question? So should she not be translated? I think that's no, because like I think, you know, translations open up people's understanding and awareness of new ideas. So I'm fully in support of translations, and I have relied heavily on them, and I'm extremely grateful for them, especially for the new translation newer translation of The Second Sex. So I appreciate that.
Okay, thank you. So Gina sent a question saying, if it can be encapsulated, how would you answer the question how to be authentic in both your perspective and the vantage point of Beauvoir's ideas?
Okay, well, I'm a little hesitant to like sum it up in, you know, really, because that's kind of the, you know, authenticity is up to each of us to kind of find our own way. And what I say in the book is it's about what Beauvoir does is kind of provide some guideposts and point us in different ways. But, you know, one of the things, or one of the points I kind of end on in the book is about becoming, you know, authenticity is really about becoming the poet of your own life. And that's inspired by, I think, a Rimbaud quote she mentions at the end of the Second Sex, which is, you know, how we creating ourselves. You know, there is no sort of static self, there's no static essence. So how are we, you know, setting goals and being brave in working towards them, and accepting responsibility for our lives and shaping the context of the world we live in. And, you know, how are we building those kind of intersubjective relationships and acknowledging our coexistence. And so those are kind of some of the things I point towards in the book, without, you know, specifically saying, oh, this is what you should do to be authentic, despite the title, which is, you know, I don't want to say it's called How to Be Authentic, but really what I say, even in the introduction, is that, you know, this is up to each of us to sort of think about.
Okay, thank you. Are there other questions? Oh yeah, Lori has a question. She says, I want to ask about authenticity in political terms, which sometimes mean authentic social identity, such as people should only write about their own experiences, white people writing about white people, for example, and not being able to authentically understand the experiences of others. It seems that you would say Beauvoir helps us with this.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I talk about in the book that I really struggled with, because on the one hand, being a white woman, I don't only want to write about, you know, my experience and white women's experiences, you know, make sure I am, you know, incorporating intersectional perspectives. And acknowledging that I can't understand what it's like for other people, but drawing on other people's stories, like that's why I mentioned people like Lorraine Hansberry, Catherine Sophia Bell Hooks, different Mickey Kendall, I mentioned, looking at these other writers to draw on what to illuminate their experience and bringing them into the conversation. And I think something Beauvoir said, I think it was in that Jurassic interview, although I'd have to check, was that if she wrote another book on women, she would make it more inclusive and include more voices in whatever was being written. And so I think she was taking on board, some of the criticisms that she hadn't kind of looked broadly enough at different experiences. But I see Beauvoir as being open to that, and I appreciate that perspective.
Anyone else? Maybe, well, Meryl, when you said that you have a very, very different reading of that interview, can it, does it interact with what we've been talking about, or not really?
Yes, sorry. I've got distracted looking for it since I can't find anything on my computer, but and now I wonder if I've lost 10 years of, no, it can't be, but it's, my reading, so there's two parts to it. One is the interview, and then there's also, there's a sort of surrounding text where she talks about, where Frieden talks about how unhappy she was because she thought she was going to meet her idol and her ideal and her, and then, and I guess many people have had the experience. Peg Simon's had the same experience, yeah, of not feeling very welcome to that. But then Frieden retaliates by, in my view, by calling Beauvoir a Maoist, which Beauvoir, she supported the Maoists, but she always took some distance from them, I think, and increasingly. But I see that, and Maureen might have some thoughts about this too. I see that as part of the argument that Beauvoir was having within US feminism, which she was losing control over at that point, because of the more radical, not long-haired, dirty, downtown, non-liberal, and lesbians too, so I always put things in a historical, well, what Skye said about, why would she have said this? So I think, so to go to the question, so I see this as part of a rearguard action on Frieden's part. But it is true that, that Beauvoir changes, that she changes her mind about things. She says, somewhere in the autobiography, she says it annoys her that people talk about Sartre as though he had not changed his mind since he was 22 about whether he liked some painter who I'd never heard of. you know, but but on the other hand, she's an amazingly consistent thinker in that, or she tries for consistency, right? She's not like, Gide, right? Who, oh, that's what I thought last week, no. But she does. Now my computer is doing funny things because I was looking for it. Sorry.
Don't worry, Meryl. I found it and put it on a Google Drive, and so everyone can access it now.
That's terrific. But there's two parts to it.
Yeah. It's the thing where there's the narrative and then the interview. Yeah,
because I see that I read that very differently because I see that there's a divergence between Frieden and Beauvoir, where Frieden, it's so interesting that you don't agree with me, because Frieden is just too American.
Yeah, but I think that's exactly what's going on, right? That Beauvoir is just so annoyed by the Americanism and the earnestness of Boba. Doesn't want to be this sort of wise old lady that the eager American comes to for advice about how to have it all. She finds it completely. She's like, this is the opposite of what I'm trying to do.
Right.
To be a sort of guru for now. Like, I think so. I think she's so annoyed with Frieden and this sort of, because it's true that it's a misunderstanding of everything Beauvoir stands for. And I think Skye's book shows it, that the ready-made solutions that Frieden is asking for in this article are against the very notion of authenticity that Beauvoir is advocating for. That she said, I'm not the one who's going to give you the solution. That's not how it works. You need to work out a solution of your own that works in your own world. And this very idea that you fly to Paris with money from now, so that I will, from my cave, my French cave, tell you what you women should do on the other side of the Atlantic, is a complete misunderstanding of Beauvoir's ideas. So I don't think we disagree so much in our reading of the interview, but maybe. But I think you're right that I didn't take into account the now situation, for sure.
Yeah.
Or generally Frieden's role, because at the time when I read this interview, I was way less aware of the sort of progressive marginality of Frieden in the feminist movement. Okay. Sandrine has a question. Sandrine Bergès. I was wondering whether the concept of living authentically could be read back into earlier lives, or whether Beauvoir has really reshaped the way we think about our lives.
I'm guessing, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm guessing that means that looking at our actions retrospectively. And I mean, I think Beauvoir gives us kind of a language and a framework to do that in a way. And I do that in the book, like, given what I've learned about Beauvoir, how can I understand some of these challenges that I was facing and that perplexed me. And and I think that's an existential kind of attitude, because we're always making leaps into the unknown and making choices, and that's creates anxiety, and sometimes we don't know, or we don't have full information about the choices we're making until afterwards. And even afterwards, we don't always have the information. But I think there's one example I talk about where I was younger and, you know, I sort of went along with what was expected of me, and I hated myself for doing it. And I was so angry, but I didn't know what to do. And yeah, and I think looking at taking Beauvoir's framework sort of helped me understand that, yeah, I could have, you know, rebelled on an individual level and pushed back and would have been, you know, thrown out of this position I was in and not look back. But also that, you know, I was operating within an oppressive structure that you know, was much bigger than me to solve, at least in that instant. And so, yeah, I think it's just to reiterate, I think I see Beauvoir as giving us a language and a framework to think about past choices we've made, but also how we're creating ourselves and how we orient ourselves into the future.
So I think Sandrine said thinking about women who lived before Beauvoir, such as Teresa of Avila, but I think actually you do spend a lot of time talking, well, not a lot of time, but I found it great actually how much time you devote to Teresa of Avila. So maybe you want to say a bit more about this.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I didn't really know much about Teresa until, you know, I went back and read the second sex for this book and realized that, oh, Beauvoir admired Teresa of Avila so much because she, you know, she did push back on what was expected of her, you know, to be a woman who became a teacher. You know, she wasn't meant to be a teacher, and she, you know, reformed the Carmelite church, and so she was a bit, you know, revolutionary in that way. But also, she wasn't telling people what to think. So, you know, she challenged people to think for themselves, and so, yeah, I talk about how Beauvoir sort of, you know, Beauvoir doesn't come up with many authentic heroes, but I think Teresa is one of the people who she comes closest to kind of pointing to as an authentic hero, because as opposed to some of the other nuns at the time who were kind of indulging in kind of self-sabotaging behavior, whereas Teresa was kind of expressing the joy of having a relationship with God to, you know, on a more universal level. So yeah, I love that story of Saint Teresa, and I appreciated Beauvoir sort of meant talking about her a little bit too. Thanks, Sandrine.
And Dennis is asking, isn't Beauvoir's evolution as a thinker why we continue to read her and write on her today? For example, the articles in our journal today are very different from the ones that appeared in the early years.
I'm assuming in the early years of researching Beauvoir. And yeah, I mean, I completely agree. There's just so much in Beauvoir to explore and understand, and to help us understand the past and understand our present times. So yeah, I totally agree with that.
I don't know if you had the same experience, but for me, it was really crazy when I reread The Second Sex after Me Too, and I saw the paragraphs on the Hollywood star and how the Hollywood star can be as powerful as she wants, and she can be the best actress, but at the end of the day, she says she's nothing else than a prey in the hands of the Hollywood producer. And in reading it through the Weinstein scandal was so striking, because I had never paid attention to that particular paragraph, and it really felt like, oh yeah, every time I read it, it resonates in different ways with the world.
Yeah, I agree. And there's that quote in The Second Sex where she says something like, a man attaches himself to woman not to enjoy her, but to enjoy himself. And so I was thinking about those instances of people like men pleasuring themselves, with women being there. That was part of the whole, some of those scandals. And, and so, yeah, Beauvoir was on it. She pointed it out that, yeah, men do this to, well, mostly men, but not all men, to enjoy their power, to make themselves feel superior, and to, assert themselves as the primary sex, and, push women into that being for others' position, and establish themselves in being for themselves. So yeah, it's striking to read that today. I agree.
And I have, since I haven't received other questions, I have a question. I think it's very interesting because, of course, your book talks about Beauvoir as a feminist, but it is not about Beauvoir's feminism. And that kind of connects with what Dennis was saying. And because I find myself in the same situation right now where I'm trying to write a sort of introduction for students to the work of Beauvoir, and I kind of want to show everything about her that is not feminism. And I think that's what makes her, that's part of the strategy to reclaim her as a philosopher, that suddenly you're like, wow, like her philosophy of time is really fascinating, and her philosophy of authenticity is fascinating, and her understanding of intersubjectivity is fascinating. So I'm not saying, of course, it's because she's a feminist. It's linked to her feminist commitments. But maybe that's also why you were saying a lot of men are reading your book. And so to what extent was it important for you to treat her as a philosopher? Because, so I'm voluntarily provocative, but what I mean is that you had been working on love, and so love in existential philosophy in general, but of course it's like, oh, Beauvoir, she loves, and suddenly you're like, this is not at all about her being a woman anymore. It's about her being a philosopher. So is that part of your project also?
Yeah, I think explicitly so. I didn't want to just put her in the box of, oh, feminist philosophy, because she's so much more than that. And so it was one of the reasons why I didn't want like feminism or feminist in like the title or even the short description. Like I intentionally kept that out because we often, women philosophers are just sort of categorized as feminist philosophers, and then, oh yeah, just put them in that bucket. But no, they, like you say, they have so much to offer. And that's why, yes, she was a philosopher. Oh yes. And she also had, feminist moments and fought for various feminist causes, but not always. And so that was, trying to shift that focus to be more than feminism was important for me.
And is it something you struggle with? Because I find myself struggling with it. I see that the students who take my classes on Beauvoir, they want the feminism and only the feminism, and they just want to talk about all the different ways in which she fails as a feminist or she succeeds as a feminist. And I'm like, hey, there's her reading of Bergson, and there's, but then I wonder, isn't it anti-feminist of me to not continually insist on her feminist side? Is it something you wonder about or struggle with? Or Laurie saying, but we could say that Beauvoir's work on time, ambiguity, politics, colonialism expand what feminism is. Yes.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. But I guess I think about it in terms of just wanting to push back on, these these boxing people or labeling people, like as Beauvoir was resistant to being labeled a philosopher or even an existentialist. So yeah, I agree, but I just, yeah, I think my focus is on making sure that we appreciate Beauvoir and like other philosophers in all their complexities, and acknowledging that, Beauvoir, feminism wasn't necessarily Beauvoir's, central stated project, because she was philosophizing, even though feminism was like a really big part of, or maybe even consequence of what she was doing. So yeah, I hope students appreciate all of it, and not just, in feminism and also beyond it.
Okay, well, thank you. Mel is saying the interview with Alice Jardine is also interesting. She says, I've written about women. I've also written about other things. Yeah, well, that's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want to maybe say a few, like, do you have other things that you would like to add, Skye, or have we?
Just that I thank you so much, Manon, for these wonderful questions, and thank you, Maureen and Gina for organizing this, and thank you all for your wonderful questions. This has been a beautiful conversation, and thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Skye, for this book.
Thank you.
Marine, the floor is yours.
Yes, Gina is gonna say a few things before.
Thank you, Maureen. Good evening from the Philippines. So Maureen and I would like to thank once again Skye Cleary and Manon Garcia for this wonderful session. We hope to have you again in our future sessions. For those who haven't purchased the book yet of Skye, please purchase your own copies. It's a wonderful book. So with the book of Manon Garcia on how we are not born submissive. Okay. So I'm tasked to give the concluding message, and this is a very special closing message because I'm also closing the 2022 webinar series. Since its inception in 2020, this webinar series project has been supported by so many partners. Of course, Maureen and I would have the International Simone de Beauvoir Society to thank for allowing us to pursue this project, through which other partners have also learned about this project. We also would like to thank Simone de Beauvoir Studies, Universities of Toulouse and Lille, University of Santo Tomas Department of Philosophy, the speakers and commentators for this year's webinar sessions, Beauvoir scholars from all over the world, and of course, all the attendees of the sessions from all over the globe, despite time differences. It's almost midnight in the Philippines. Despite busy schedule, despite internet connectivity problems, our participants managed to be in attendance. So thank you very much for that. In a special way, of course, we thank Zoom for connecting us all together, no matter where we are. And it is because of this zest from all of you and our partners that we strive to continue with this project. So as announced earlier, while we're closing this year's webinar series, we look forward to more amazing sessions next year that might be held online or hopefully in person. How about that, Maureen? At this juncture, I wish to invite anyone who may be interested to be part of the 2023 sessions. Any theme related to Beauvoir's life, works, and thoughts are welcome. So please feel free to reach us if you want to share your work through this platform. Ladies and gentlemen, it has been an honor for Maureen and I to lead this project on behalf of the International Simone de Beauvoir Society. I now officially close the Beauvoir Webinar Series 2022 and see you again for our 2023 series. Thank you very much and good night from the Philippines.
Bye. Thank you all. See you very soon.
Thank you all.
Bye. Thank you, Skye, and thank you, Manon. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye.
Bye.